Yeah. Good morning, my dear students. Today I will just introduce about the Poetics written by Aristotle. As you know, it's a part of your literary criticism. So first of all, if we want to proceed with Poetics, so we need to remember three major important things. That is, what does the name Poetics signify? Number two, what does the Poetics cover? And number three, the compulsion of composing the Poetics. So from these 3 points of view, we will describe the introductory note of today's class. So first of all, as you may have known that the word Poetics may cover poetry or the poets or related theories that cover poetry and also poets. Yeah, you are absolutely right. It discusses the poetic forms and the features of poetry and also the nature of the poets who used to write those poetry. But one thing should be noted, whenever we will try to cover the poetry, we will find that Aristotle covered a specific genres of poetry. According to him, he just tried to explain 3 types of poetry. That is, poetry in actions. For example, narrative poetry, that is epic poetry, and also dramatic poetry like tragic poetry and comic poetry that we nowadays call tragedy and poetry. So you may have one question here, why Aristotle called them as tragic poetry and comic poetry? What is his intention to call them as tragic poetry and comic poetry? You should know that at that time when Aristotle revolved, the literary forms only evolved through the shapes of poetry. That what a poetry covers or a poem covers, also tragedy, maybe tragic comedy, or tragedy or comedy, pure comedy, that covers everything. But in case of tragedy and poetry, the action is important and the story is dealt through action. So this is the basic thing that Aristotle tried to expose the nature of tragedy, comedy, that he called dramatic poetry, also tragic poetry and comic poetry. And on the other hand, there is also one narrative poetry that is called today epic poetry. So this is the description what he covered. Then what is the compulsion of writing this, composing this Poetics? We think that Aristotle then tried to impose some theorem that he didn't believe, I think, that the future generation should follow this. But what he wanted to do, he wanted to expose the features of this tragic poetry or comic poetry or narrative poetry evolving at his time of existence. So he wanted to dig out the features of those types of literary forms and wanted to just show the future, maybe the future generations or contemporary writers, that what they should follow, what they should avoid to become a successful writer in the case of writing tragic poetry or comic poetry or just you can say narrative poetry. So in this way, first of all, he tried to just dig out the features of those types of literary forms and the features of writers what they tried to impose through this poetry form. And number two, through this writing, I think perhaps he had some guidelines for the contemporary writers. As you know, there are competitions for day every year round, and through this competition the writers used to participate in this competition, and who would win the competition had been recognized as the greatest of all time, or greatest novelist, greatest tragic poetry writer or comic poetry writer or narrative poetry was not in competition that so far we have known through the history. So in this way, he tried to just find some ways that their contemporary writers should follow. So in poetry poetics that we would discuss in these courses, that in these courses the poetics will be evolving through the classification and origins, differences between these forms, and evolution and definition of tragedy, and most important elements plot structure, unity and casualty, types of plots, proper tragic hero, spectacle and emotion, and also poetic style and use of language, and epic versus tragedy. So from these chapters, what he tried to just put for us, we will try to dig out in our next lectures, and in this way we have arranged this lecture series. So I think thank you for today. This is the introductory note, and you have to remember these crucial issues: the naming of the poetic, what does it cover, the intention of Aristotle, like this. Thank you.